and welcome to this fourth recording in the Azure Demo Series. Today's lab is focused on creating virtual machines in Azure, and it's very important to note that the demos that we'll be doing today are not the only options for creating virtual machines in Azure. Now, they are among the most common methods of creating virtual machines, but not the only options. So, for instance, we could use an infrastructure as code tool like Terraform to automate the whole process of creating and deploying our Azure virtual machines. We could also use something like Azure CLI, which is not covered in this lab today. So, the other thing that I wanted to point out earlier is that there could be a second part to this recording, depending on how long this fourth part gets. So the first part, let me show you what we're going to focus on. In the first part, we're going to focus on creating Azure virtual machines using the Azure portal and using Azure PowerShell. So that's what we'll focus on. We'll focus on creating and verifying. Now, the second part will be focused on creating or deploying Azure VMs using the Azure Resource Manager, also known as ARM template. So we'll be focusing on deploying ARM templates and that creates Azure virtual machines using different options. We will use Visual Studio, for example. We'll use Azure PowerShell, and then we'll use Azure CLI. So that could be in the second part, or it could be part of this video, depending on how long it gets. So that being said, what exactly are we following today? This is the lab that we're following today. If we go back on the GitHub instructions page, and the lab we're following today is lab 03. There's one below here, lab answer key 03. And this is what we're following today. So let's get into it. Let's get into the first exercise. The goal of the very first exercise, let's see, scroll up, be to create virtual machines using Azure portal and using Azure PowerShell. So task number one will be focused on using Azure portal, and then we'll do Azure PowerShell after. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is if I go back to this diagram here, this is what we'll end up with. So I think we'll be deploying VM1 using Azure portal, VM2 using Azure PowerShell, VM3 using Azure ARM templates, deployed via Visual Studio, on and on and on, till we end up with what we're essentially seeing here, which is a virtual network with 3 subnets and 5 virtual machines spread across the subnet or the different tiers: web tier, application tier, and database tier. Let's just get into the first exercise today. Ensure that you're logged into your lab VM. And first thing I'll do, I'll just use Chrome here. I'll bring up the Azure portal. So that'll be portal.azure.com. And I will ensure that I'm signed in using my credentials. So this is really straightforward. I'm sure many of you have done this multiple times, so I'll just run through it. So we're creating using the Azure portal. Different methods that I could use. I could go on the virtual machines and click add from there. I could also just click on new from here, and I will click on compute, and I'll click on Windows Server 2016 data center. So for the name of the VM, let's call this VM1. So that name VM1. So back to the diagram, that's this VM over here. That's what we're creating now, and we're going to be putting it in the database subnet in this VNet. So disk type, I'll change that to HDD, and I'll set the username as student, and the password will be the password that we have in the lab or in the lab manual. So regarding resource group, I'll go ahead and create a new resource group, and I'll give it the same name that we have in the lab instructions. And I'll leave that selection as West Europe because I do have the license. So I'll go ahead and click yes to save some money there, and I'll click OK to that. When it comes to the VM size, I'll select D1 V2 standard and I'll click on select. I'll leave manage disk sets to yes. So when it says availability set here, I'll create a new availability set. So availability set is something that you must put in machine into an availability set at the time of deployment if you want it to be in one. If you do not add a virtual machine to an availability set at the time of deployment, you can't go back to re-add it. You have to recreate that virtual machine. Now you can reattach the disk, but you have to recreate it still. So I'll change the default. I change the default domain to 3 and the update domains to 5, and I'll click OK to that. So going back on this page, virtual network, I'll click here, make some changes there. Give it the naming convention that we have in our lab manual and the address space that we have in our lab manual. And this will be the first subnet database. And I have to give it a range that's consistent with our VNet range. So that's 10/20 and that's 10/24. So let's go ahead and click OK to that. Okay, so I'll leave the public IP address setting as the default. I'll leave network security group as the default. Extension, I'll leave that. Auto shutdown, I'll also leave that. And monitoring, I'll leave that. And I'll just go ahead and click OK. So it's going to run the validation. And it's detected that it passed the validation. So now it's giving me the option to click on create, and I'll go ahead and just click that. And then the deployment is submitted. So what I'll do is while this is going on, I'll proceed to do the other deployment using PowerShell. So I'll be deploying this VM2 now into the same subnet, and I'll be using PowerShell for that. For me to do that, if I just monitor the deployment, ensure that if I refresh that, I'll just ensure that my network is being created, so that's good. If I go under virtual networks, and I have my virtual network there. If I go on the subnet, I can see that my subnet has been created. So that means I can go ahead and to the next step. So for the next step, I'll need to open PowerShell ISE, the integrated scripting environment, and run that as administrator. So once that starts up, so we have a script that we'll be using. So if I go ahead and click File and I click on Open, if I go to under the E drive, remember that's where we, or the E volume, that's where we store the lab files. And then if I go on the lab files here and on the lab 03, which is where we are on the starter. So there is this PowerShell script, new 20533D03 lab VM2. If I click on that and click on open, that goes ahead and opens that PowerShell script. So what I'll do here is we'll make a bit of, we'll just run through this. So first thing that we'll do is we'll sign into our Azure account. If we have multiple Azure subscriptions, in this case I only have one, but if we did, we could use this to specifically, so this is actually pointing to a script. So what this will allow us to do, the part of the modules that we imported earlier, but what this will allow us to do is it will allow us to select a subscription that we want, and also we'll assign different variables. So the different parameters that we completed in the Azure portal, things like the resource group name, the virtual machine name, the publisher of the machine, so Windows Server, the offer, the SKU, the VM size that we want. So all those different parameters that we specified in the portal with some extras, because now we're going using this command line scripting method. There are some other parameters that we had to specify. So for example, we're specifying the OS disk size here. We didn't have to do that when we did it through the portal. It just automatically configure them using the default. Let's go ahead and just do this. So what I'll just do is I'll go ahead and click this run script button here. And if I click on that, it's going to begin to execute the script. Sign in with my details. Put in my password. So it's asking me if you want to run the other scripts that I mentioned. I'll just click on run once. So it's detected that I have only one subscription. So it's not prompting me to select a subscription. So that's why it says I'm just going to use the single subscription that you have. And what it's beginning to do is it's beginning to load all these different variables. It's going to create it's going to not create a virtual network because we already have a virtual network. In this case, it's going to get information of that virtual network and put it in a variable, get information about our subnet, put it in a variable. It's going to get the location of our VNet and put that in a variable. It's going to get the current Azure storage account, put that in a variable. Again, it's just assigning variables at this point. Not until it gets to this point did we actually begin to create resources in Azure. So now we're beginning to create the network security group, we're creating the public IP, and we're referencing the different variables that we created earlier. So now we're identifying the availability sets, the existing one, and we're setting our VM configuration and we're creating our VM. So there's a good script that you can refer to if you need to do this. What I'll do now is, because everything is still going on, I think this is still, oh, deployment succeeded for this, good. So what we can do is if I go under virtual machines now, I can see my VM already running. So this is the one that I created using the Azure portal, and this is the one that I'm currently creating using Azure PowerShell. As you can see, that's in the process of being created. Also, if I go into resource groups, I can see I've put everything in a single resource group. If I click on that resource group, I can see all the resources that had to be created for me to have this virtual machine. So it's not just a simple I have a VM, it's creating all these different resource types. The availability set is a different resource type. The storage accounts that we're storing, the monitoring, the managed disks that we have. And you can see that it's creating like a lot of resources here just to get two virtual machines. So I think what I'll do is I'll pause the recording, wait for the deployment to complete, and when I come back, we'll proceed with the rest of the lab. Okay, so the deployment completed in PowerShell also, and we have our two virtual machines deployed and running using two different methods. So the next part of this lab will be part 3B, and what we'll be covering in this case, we're going to be deploying Azure VMs using Azure Resource Manager ARM templates. And we're going to be covering three methods of deploying ARM templates. We're going to deploy an ARM template using Visual Studio. We're going to deploy an ARM template using Azure PowerShell. We're going to deploy an ARM template using Azure CLI. So an ARM template is just a way to describe our virtual machines in JSON format. Let's go back here, and I'm within my lab virtual machine in this case. What I'll do if I go to the desktop, I have Visual Studio here. Let's open Visual Studio. So at this point, I'm doing this first exercise, which is our goal is to deploy an Azure ARM template using Visual Studio. And then we're going to verify using Azure PowerShell that our resources that we deployed just straight from Visual Studio have indeed been deployed. So that's what we're doing in this exercise. So this may take a while to open, so I'll pause the recording and then I'll come back. It seems like it aired me speaking. I'll still pause the recording and come back once it's finished. Yeah, I wanted to bring this up. So in case you click on Visual Studio for the first time, it may ask you to sign in. So just go ahead and click on sign in and put in your Azure credentials there. put in your password and click on sign in there. So I'll pause the recording and take a while to come up. So it's asking me to select a theme. I'll go ahead and just leave the default and click on Start Visual Studio. And then I'll pause the recording again and then come back once it's finished loading. Okay, here we are, Visual Studio open now. So in our lab files, we do have a pre-created ARM template. So if I go on the file, on open project or solution and click on that. And then if I browse to this PC and browse to my E volume, and within that, if I go on the lab files and lab 03, and then if I click on the starter and on the projects, and there will be this folder, res dev linux deploy. If I click on that, I'll find this solution file here. If I go ahead and click on that solution file, then that should load that into Visual Studio. By the way, what we're currently doing now is we're going to be deploying this application server into this app subnet within our existing VNet, and we're going to be doing it using an ARM template deployed directly via Visual Studio. So that's what we're doing next. Let's go back. Okay, so we're here. Scrolling up. So here's a ham template that just describes our VM. So I think at some point I'll be coming out with a video on Azure ham template deep dive to give more information, because I think it's a really useful thing to know. This is one of the useful reasons for using Visual Studio when writing your Azure ham template. Is number one, you can get this JSON outline here, which makes it more easier for you to navigate your template. You can see where the parameters and the variables and then the resources there. And then you can click on each one, go to that section, make whatever changes you can do or that you want to make. Also, Visual Studio has this thing called as IntelliSense, which means it's able to read the schema of what this template should be. And then it's able to highlight to you whenever you're going against the rules of the schema. So for example, I've got the curly bracket here followed by a comma. If I go ahead and delete the comma, Visual Studio is going to detect and it's going to highlight to me that you're missing something there because it's read the schema, it's able to detect that. I'll go ahead and put my comma back. Let's go ahead and deploy this. So I'll go ahead and right click, res dev linux deploy, and then click on deploy and then click on new. And then it's going to ask me, because I've already signed in with my Azure account, it's going to ask me what do I want to deploy to here. In this case, I'll go ahead and click, let's see, I have my account here already. Edit parameters here. So if I go ahead and click edit parameters, and then I can see, so now that's set to VM4, I'll change that to VM3 according to the instructions. Student the username, I'll put in the password that we have in the instructions there. So virtual network name, I'll copy what we currently have here and paste it here. Resource group name, I'll copy that and paste that there. Subnet name, I'll leave that set to app. Subnet prefix, that matches what we have in our document, which is 10.0.1.0/24. The VM size, the standard D1 V2, which is what we want. It's an Ubuntu machine, so we'll leave that as the Ubuntu OS version. And the storage account type, we'll leave that as standard LRS, and then we'll click on save. So here we have to select the resource group that we want to deploy this into. We'll be deploying it into the same resource group. So I'll go ahead and select that. By the way, we could have created a new one if we wanted to, but I'll go ahead and leave that. And then we can just click on deploy here. And then what it's going to do is it's going to start deploying this directly from Visual Studio, this ARM template, straight into Azure subscription. The other thing that we can do is we can actually use PowerShell to validate that the resources have been deployed. Let me just go ahead and show us how to do that. If you don't have PowerShell open, if you go ahead and open it, which I'll go ahead and open properly here and run as administrator. So very first thing that I'll do is I'll add my Azure account to PowerShell, sign in. So that's going to sign me in. I can do get Azure VM subscription. It shows me my subscription and the ID of the subscription. If I had more than one subscription and I want to specify one in particular, I can use this command of set Azure VM context and then specify my subscription ID to go ahead and set that. And then what I can do is from here, I can begin to list can use this command here or this long command here to check in my resource group. And I'm going to list all the resources there. I'm going to format it in a nice table, the resource name and the resource type. If I go ahead and press enter to that, it's going to show me what I currently have. So now you can see that VM3 is currently being deployed. I can see the managed disks, the network interface cards, the public IP. So I can see that that's all been deployed just by using PowerShell. Let's move on to the next exercise. Yeah, it's finished. It's successfully deployed the template. If I go back to Azure Portal 2 for refresh, I can see that it's still saying creating here, but you can see that as far as Visual Studio is concerned, it's completely deployed that job, and the Azure Fabric controller is currently applying that. Moving on to the next exercise. That'll be exercise number 2 in this case. Now we're still going to be using an Azure ham template to deploy an Azure VM, but in this case we'll be using Azure PowerShell, not Visual Studio, as the method to deploy the ham template. So that's what we're doing in this case. So let's go back to our lab VM. Have open Azure PowerShell ISC. If you've closed it, reopen it. And this case, this time I'll browse to File, Open. I'll go under the E volume on the lab files, on the lab 03, on the starter, on the templates. And there's this PowerShell script called deploy Azure resource group. If I double click and open that, I can see what this is doing. So what this is doing is we can specify our ham template. We can specify our resource group name. We can specify a deployment name and then just use PowerShell to say, take this ham template and deploy it. So rather than using Visual Studio, we can do that. So what I'll do in this case also is if I go back to Visual Studio and let's see the templates that we're deploying this time around. If I click on File, Open, and this time around, I'll click on File, my project or solutions. If I click on File. And on the file, if I go back to my E volume and then go on the lab files, on the lab 03, on the starter, on the template, and there's this template, this JSON file, Azure Deploy Web VM. If I go ahead and double click and open that. And what we're trying to do in this case, if I go back to our diagram, is we're trying to deploy this virtual machine in its web subnet. So we'll deploy the web subnet at the same time the virtual machine in that subnet. We're going to be using an ham template deployed using PowerShell. So you can see it's similar to the one that we deployed earlier. The only difference is the methods that we'll be using for deploying it. So we can view this. Let's see, do we need to make any changes here? No, there's no changes that we need to make. So if we go back to our PowerShell ISC environment, and then if we go ahead and run this, now there are certain parameters that are not included that we'll need to specify. Remember that even when we use Visual Studio, then we still needed to edit parameters. If I go ahead and just click on Run Script here, it's going to ask for the VM name. I'll put in the name that we have in a lab document. Press enter to that. It's going to ask for the admin password. I'll get the admin password that we have in the lab document and put that in there and click OK. It's going to ask for the virtual network name. I'll get that also. By the way, we could automate all this also. And then the VM size, in this case, standard D1 V2, standard underscore D1 underscore V2. Enter. And then what will happen is it's going to begin the deployment of the ham template using PowerShell. What we can also do in this case, or one of the things that I like with this, is we can go to our Azure portal, and if I go under the resource group, because we're deploying still to this resource group, if I click under that resource group and then I click under deployment here, I can see right from here the deployment that I've instigated or that I started from using PowerShell. I can see that deployment here. I can still click on that deployment name and see what resources it's deploying and which state it's at. So we can monitor our deployment, the ham template deployment that we've deployed using PowerShell from the Azure portal. So let's move to exercise number 3 now, which will be our final exercise for today. And that will be, we'll be doing exactly the same thing that we just finished doing now. But rather than using Azure PowerShell as the method of deploying the ham template, we're going to be using Azure CLI, just so we know we can deploy our template using Azure CLI. Let's go ahead and do that. So in this case, what I'll do is back to my lab VM, open command prompt and run it as administrator. And then I'll do AZ login to log into my Azure environment. If this takes a while, which it looks like it is doing, I'll pause the recording and then come back once it displays the URL and the code. Oh, here we go. So I have my URL that I need to go to, and I have the codes that I need to put into that. Put in my code and then click on continue. Select my account, and then it says I've signed in. So I should see the success here in a minute or in a few seconds, hopefully. Oh, here we go. So I had to press enter there. So I can do an AZ account show, which will show me essentially the same thing that we have. And then I can do the same thing. Let's say I have multiple subscriptions. I can go ahead and use this command here to set a particular subscription. But I only have one subscription, so I don't need to worry about this. What I'll do then is I'll go ahead and the same that we did with PowerShell here, there's an Azure CLI equivalent of this. So if I paste that in there, AZ group deployment creates this deployment. But in this case, let's see, we're going to be deploying into our same resource group, and we're going to be deploying a template file. But this time around, we're changing the parameter name. VM6 and virtual network name is still the same. So that's what we're doing. So how we're doing is now, let's go back to our diagram, is we're deploying this final VM into this web subnet, and we're going to be deploying using an ham template, but the deployment method of the ham template is Azure CLI. So let's make sure that's fine, and if I go ahead and press enter to that, so it's asking me for the admin password, and I'll put in the password that we have. So you know what, I'll just type it in here. And press enter. VM size, specify D1 V2, enter, and it started the deployment now. And the same way that we are able to monitor our PowerShell ham template deployment from the Azure portal, if I go back here, if I refresh this, I can see my deployment also from here, and I can begin to monitor it from here also. So that's it for today. I hope that was really useful for you, and I hope that now you understand, at least to an extent, some of the different methods that we can use to create and deploy Azure VMs. So I look forward to seeing you in the next recording. So in the next recording, what we're going to cover, let's go back here. And in this case, that's lab number 4. And the focus on this will be on managing Azure VM. So things like creating and configuring an Azure load balancer, which is an important topic. We're going to use Azure PowerShell DSC, which is really which is really exciting. We're going to use it to automatically configure a VM. So now we've automatically deployed VMs, but what about configuring the VMs themselves to a state that we want them to be in? One of the options that we have is using Azure PowerShell DSC, which can be confusing to many people, but we'll do a lab on this in the next recording. And let's see. And then we'll cover using the normal storage space that we are familiar with, or that many of us are familiar with, to configure a volume on an Azure VM. And that will be it. So I look forward to seeing you in the next recording. Bye for now.